I've often found that in life, our strengths tend to also be our weaknesses. If I'm extremely sensitive and emotionally attuned, maybe it's hard for me to then control those emotions. If I'm extremely logical and analytical, maybe it's hard for me to tune into the feelings of others. If I've been taught perseverance and long-suffering by being a Washington Commanders fan for a long time, maybe I've also been relieved of my hope and ability to believe good things about the world around me. Our strengths tend to also be our weaknesses. For me personally, I think my strength when I teach people about how to talk about Jesus with others who don't believe in Jesus is focusing on the idea of making the gospel beautiful to others, of showing the ways that the gospel is the only truly right solution to our various human conundrums. And I think that's a good thing. That's what God has made me particularly able to talk about. That's my strength. But I also have to acknowledge that I sometimes tend to neglect some other ways that the gospel goes out and does its work. Some other, as Colossians put it, some other doors that open up for the gospel. And so today we're focusing on some of the other ways that the gospel tends to spread and what those ways tell us about what is important in life. Where are our priorities? So this morning, let's look at Acts chapter 18. We're going to look at three things. The first one is going to be we're going to see the gospel spreading what I call vocationally. So let's look at verses 1 through 3, and then we'll skip ahead to kind of 18 and 19. After this, Paul's time in Athens, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them, Paul. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Pausing there, skipping ahead to verse 18, and we're going to read 18 in the first half of verse 19. After this, Paul stayed many days longer at Corinth, and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchreae he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow, and they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. We'll pause there for now. Now, I know, when you saw that word, I think I have a thing up here. When you saw that word, that first word come up on the screen, you had a sudden uplifting thought that I was about to tell you that you needed to share the gospel by going on vacation more. And you know what? Rest is really important in our lives. And so, you know what? In many ways, I agree with that sentiment. You're welcome. But that's not the primary focus of this particular point in this particular message. The word we're focusing on is vocation, not vacation. The concept of vocation, and really the word itself, it had its rise in the 1400s. This is a pretty old concept, but it doesn't go all the way back to the Bible. It rose as a way to describe the increasingly popular lifestyle of monasticism. People going to be monks and nuns and dedicating their lives to a life of service. It was something that was used to describe a calling that was a lifelong calling, that was a fully absorbed calling, but that was not necessarily a calling to full-time ministry. It wasn't a call to the priesthood. It wasn't a call to go and be a missionary, but it was a lifelong call. But if we fast forward to the Protestant Reformation about 100 years later, the movement in which our denomination finds its most recent roots, the Reformers found the word vocation to be a perfect way to describe a concept that was starting to spring up and take more and more power as the Scriptures were being opened up more and more by normal people around the world and not just by priests or bishops or whatever else. this idea of vocation, a calling that is all-absorbing, your whole life is connected to it in some way, shape, or form, but also is not a call to full-time ministry, was perfect for the Reformers. They said, yes, this is a true and real and good thing when we look at the Bible, and it's not just for monks. It's not just for nuns. This is something that is for all of us. They said all of us have a vocation. We all have a calling on our lives to bring God glory in whatever it is He has us doing on a day-to-day basis. You live out your vocation as you seek to glorify God in every corner of the life that He has given you specifically, and no other person. The Reformers started a movement toward what would eventually become the consensus in Protestant Christianity that full-time ministry, that a calling to full-time ministry is in no way, shape, or form superior to being called to another vocation in life. So because it's where I ended up, I live out my vocation by preaching and teaching and counseling, but that vocation is no more important, no more glorifying to God than what we might think of as secular jobs. I do the air quotes because for Christians, there really isn't a divide between sacred and secular. As the Dutch reformer Abraham Kuyper put it, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. God says there is no secular, all of it belongs to me. So somebody can glorify God by fixing a pipe just as well as they can by giving a sermon, by raising a child as by balancing a budget, by building a business as by telling wonderful stories, by organizing and moving stock just as much as by teaching students. We can and do glorify God in our everyday lives, in our individual vocations, callings, when we set our minds and hearts on glorifying God on a daily basis, on lifting His name up, on being the person He's called us to be the best that we can. And here in our passage, we see that God not only uses that for His glory, but He also uses it for the good of the people around us, in bringing them to Christ or raising them up in Christ. Because why did Paul get connected to Priscilla and Aquila? Priscilla and Aquila are one of the most kind of name recognition sets of missionaries through the rest of the New Testament. They're right up there with folks like Barnabas, Silas, Timothy, where you see their name over and over again through Paul's work going forward. How did Paul get connected? Did he go to Indeed.com/Roman Empire and look under the potential missionaries willing to work for little to no pay and risk death constantly tab? No. I hope you know no. There was no internet back then. That's not happening. Paul engaged in his vocation. Paul was a tent maker. That was his trade. It was how he raised money to live on as he was moving around telling people about the gospel. He engaged in his vocation, and he connected with his fellow workers in a way that pointed to Jesus. We don't know for sure whether or not Priscilla and Aquila were already Christians before this. But we do know that we saw no sign whatsoever that they were traveling with spreading the gospel in mind. They're refugees when we see them for the first time. They got kicked out of Rome and they're looking for a good landing place. They are just trying to get their feet under them. But when we see them later in the passage, we see them traveling with Paul from Corinth to Ephesus. And in fact, Paul basically skips Ephesus entirely, spends maybe a few days there and then moves on. But he leaves Priscilla and Aquila to continue carrying on the missionary work there in town. Your vocation, whatever it is not a mistake. It's not even neutral. It matters. It was specifically chosen for you at this moment in your life. You are there to glorify God in your work, your calling, your whatever it is that occupies your days, and you are also there to be a light for the people that you connect with. Whether those are bricklayers or lawyers, toddlers or parents, your kids or your employees. Whatever situation God has put you in, that situation is something He can use for His glory and for your good and the good of the people around you. And in fact, He can even turn situations that look like they're going south into ones that are opportunities to spread His good news. So let's keep reading. We're going to go in verses 4 through 11, and I forgot to tell the tech team we're reading verse 4, so you can either follow with me in your Bible or you can listen to the dulcet tones of my voice. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." And he stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. We get in this passage one of the beautiful turns in circumstance that we find in the Bible that points us towards the hope that we have in the gospel. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, talked about a pattern in literature that he saw popping up in stories all over the place in different cultures and times and so on and so forth. He called that pattern eucatastrophe. Eucatastrophe. He defined it as something good, even glorious, coming out of something that seemed utterly terrible. So it's a miracle coming out of a disaster. Tolkien talked about the prevalence of that thread all throughout literature, and he said it shows up over and over because our hearts know there is something good and right and true about it. Tolkien said that it was kind of like our hearts were recognizing the melody of resurrection. We were recognizing resurrection's music. See, the story of Jesus is the story of a person who was unmarred by sin and brokenness in the way that all the rest of us are. And so just by Jesus walking into the room, the people who thought they had it all together had their air of perfection challenged. They either rebelled against it or they were born again with their arrogance and their self-importance stripped away from them in the light of His perfection. And yet when those who knew they were broken and hurting and sick looked at Him, they found themselves suddenly whole and healed and healthy in a way that they had never imagined being able to find. And we, broken, prideful, self-destructive sinners that we are, we killed Him. That was our answer. So that we would stop being reminded of our brokenness, we killed the one who could make us whole. This is a catastrophe of epic, cosmic portions. It is everything going wrong. But as one of my favorite songs about the resurrection right now puts it, then the ground began to shake. We felt the stone beneath us break, and He came back. He came back anyway. The resurrection was the eucatastrophe of our whole world. The story, past, present, and future. Ultimate sadness in the death of our hope, overwhelmed and obliterated by the light of a new hope and joy in finding that God had come to ransom us back from death, and that by His death Jesus had defeated the power of death itself. Every other eucatastrophe in the Bible is designed to pull our attention back to that one, including the one we see here today. See, Paul comes to town and he starts preaching. He starts warming the pump. He starts getting things ready. And then Paul gets his A-list of supporting missionaries around him. It's Silas. It's Timothy. We've got the rising stars in Priscilla and Aquila. I'm like watching the football intro in my head, and it's like, yeah, stars coming to town. We're going to see what happens. Everything's warming up right. And they go to the synagogue, the place in town where people who know who Yahweh is will be. And certainly these people will be primed and ready to go. The message will naturally be welcome, right? No. In fact, it says that those who were there in the synagogue universally despised, opposed, and reviled them. Those are nasty words, reviled especially. This is not just that those in the synagogue said, Paul, I'm afraid we have an irreconcilable difference here, my good man. We sincerely hope that you will be well and welcome to come back and talk to us another time. No, this is shouting, this is jeering, this is them cussing them out, this is them threatening violence towards them. They did everything they could to deny that they were even worthy of listening to before they started throwing the rotten vegetables. They're absolutely rejecting Paul's message. This seems like a catastrophe for the work of God in Corinth. If you were a modern church growth expert watching this happen, you would be like, Paul, it is time to cut bait and run, man. I don't know if you're not the answer or if these people aren't. Something's wrong here. Get out of town. Go start somewhere else. But that's not how God works. And so they leave, and wouldn't you know it, there's someone right next door to the synagogue who did hear what they were saying, who was listening to them. And he wants to hear the good news. And he's so excited about it that he wants them to stay with him in his house for the whole time they're there in Corinth. And then, wonder of wonders, miracle of miracles, after the whole synagogue screams and reviles Paul, who's the next convert? It's Crispus, the leader of said synagogue, who comes to Christ. And then Paul has a dream, he has a vision, and God says, despite all the reviling, which apparently included threats of violence, he says, don't worry about it. You're going to be okay. Stay. Do the work. I will protect you. And Paul ends up staying in Corinth a year and a half. I'm pretty sure this is the longest stay for Paul anywhere in any of his missionary journeys where he wasn't chained to a wall. Like outside of prison stints and house arrest, this is the longest that Paul ever stays in one spot in the book of Acts. And that happens in a city where it looked for a hot minute like it was going to get the shake the dust off my boots and move on treatment. We can glorify God and we can tell other people about Him, sometimes even when it seems like everything is going sideways. I think this story should really give us a lot of hope and confidence in being able to be God's witnesses in our culture today, in wherever it is that God has placed us, whatever situations we find ourselves in, to know that even if it looks rough, God can still work things out for His glory and for our good. And then there's one last thing we see here in the passage. I think as we're going to skip along to verse 24, and I think we see the gospel spreading out not just by going wider, but also by going deeper. Let's read verses 24 to 28. So this is in Ephesus after Paul has left, but Priscilla and Aquila are still there. Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the Scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. It's a really interesting thing that we get here as the conclusion to our narrative this morning. Priscilla and Aquila stay behind in Ephesus. Paul moves on, and someone shows up in the city who is preaching almost the gospel. Almost. Apparently, Apollos, this guy Apollos, is so well read in the Scriptures, he's so devoted to the Lord, that even though he came to faith during John the Baptist's ministry, before Jesus started his ministry, and probably because he lived in Egypt, he missed what went on with Jesus' ministry. He missed the crucifixion and resurrection. He is so tuned in to what the Bible was promising that the Messiah would be like, that he was basically arguing for the idea of Jesus without actually knowing Jesus. And I think that's a really good place to pause in our story this morning. Because I think sometimes we come to church and on Sunday and we assume everybody present is right where we are. We assume that we're all here for exactly the same reason, whatever that reason is. But I think Apollos is a wonderful reminder that we're all in different places and that we can be almost there without being all there. That we can be crazy about the idea of Jesus, but we're still trying to figure out what it actually looks like to get connected to him. In his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Pete Scazzero talks about hitting the wall. He talks about how many Christians can find Jesus, kind of get excited about the idea, even start learning about him and serving in his name, without ever really having our hearts transformed by him. And he says that if that happens, when we run into something heavy in life, when we hit a wall, whatever that looks like, he says it can knock us right out of our socks because we didn't have a foundation in Jesus to be able to do something about it. We didn't have the grounding in Jesus to handle it. He shares a story of a man in his church who said, I've been a Christian for 25 years, but I'm not a 25-year-old Christian because I've been a 1-year-old Christian 25 times. It's this idea, it's very possible to be at that intro stage and then just get stuck. There are people sitting around you today, and maybe you're one of them. There's no shame in that. We need to acknowledge where we are so that we can work on things, who love the idea of Jesus and are still figuring out, how do I get connected to him? Our passage today says that the first step is don't be content with the idea of Jesus. Don't be like if Apollos had been listening and said, I don't want to get corrected. I don't want to learn more. What are you doing to me here? Get out of here, Priscilla and Aquila. I'm doing good. These people are listening to me. I got some influence here. We're doing good stuff. Don't be content with the idea of Jesus. Get connected to who he is. It says that one way that we do that is by really digging into who Jesus is and what he taught. Priscilla and Aquila pull Apollos aside and they say, let's really dig into this. Let's learn about it more accurately. Let's dig in together. We can't be content ourselves, and you know what? I think if we love each other, we should put some pressure on each other to not be content with being happy about being almost Christians or being that 25-year-old, 1-year-old Christian. Don't hear me wrong. This is a don't hear what I'm not saying morning. Don't be a jerk to somebody because they have slightly different doctrine than you. Do not be pressing someone and pressuring them and so on and so forth because they only believe 98% of the same things you do. Not what we're talking about this morning. I love our denomination's motto where it says, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity. We're not talking about kind of the core of the faith here. We're talking about sanctification. We're talking about spiritual maturity. We're talking about growing in our connection to God, growing closer to him. And the second thing, so if the first thing is we got to dig down more on Jesus, the second reality is we can't do that by ourselves. Henry Nouwen was a theologian who wrote, we need loving friends with whom we can speak from the depth of our heart. Such friends can take away the paralysis that secrecy creates. They can offer us a safe and sacred space where we can express our deepest sorrows and joys. They can confront us in love. We need each other. We need other Christians if we're going to break through that wall, if we're going to learn about Jesus more and more. And here's where I get a little bit maybe uncomfortable in my application this morning. The reality is, those kinds of connections, the ones we're seeing here between Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos, cannot happen in 5 minutes before and after a Sunday service. They can't. It's not possible. We need to be in each other's homes. We need to be studying this stuff together. We need to be talking about it. We need to be having fun conversations and serious ones. We need to be studying Jesus, but we also need to be studying each other, listening to each other's hopes and dreams and fears, and digging into who God is and what it means, who He is means to every area of our lives, our vocations and our callings, the areas where we feel stuck or where we feel like things aren't working out, and the areas where we just feel like I need to dig deeper, I need to get more. My kind of closing challenge this morning is this: find someone to be digging deeper with in the coming year. Maybe it's a small group, maybe it's a Bible study, but maybe it's a group of friends getting together to talk about things that matter and pray regularly. Maybe it's you inviting a few other folks over to eat and laugh and cry and talk about the things that really matter in life. Whatever the right answer is for you, find it. Put effort into it. Chase down other people in the church and get connected. Don't be content with the idea of Jesus. Be digging ever deeper into a connection to who He is, to the real person of Jesus.